Hello everyone, welcome to the Bagaden. Today we will talk about how you can use gRPC to communicate between two Spring Boot microservices. In this video, we will focus only on implementing gRPC communication in Spring Boot. Now remember, in this video we will not discuss anything about gRPC or why it's used. I am assuming you are already aware of this. But if you want me to make a video on this, please drop a comment. For this video, I will be following this Medium course or article, which is written by me, of course. Let's get started straight away with the prerequisites. Here are the things you need to make this work. You need Java 17 or higher, Spring Boot 3 or higher, Maven as your build tool, and like mentioned earlier, some basic knowledge of Spring Boot and gRPC. First step is to create two Spring Boot projects. These two will talk to each other using gRPC. The first one would be to create a server, or let's also call it the service. And the second one would be to create an aggregator, which is also the client. The client will call the server using gRPC protocol. The server will reply back with some data that the client is seeking. To create these Spring Boot applications, you can just go to Spring Initializer and download a demo sort of a project. Or you can just go to IntelliJ and you can set up a Maven project, add these couple of dependencies, which make a Maven project a Spring project, and you'd be done. You can just do an MV clean install and run it, and your app will be ready to use. Needless to say, I am not diving very deep into this first step because I am assuming that you already know a lot about this. You have already set up Spring Boot projects, and now you just want to see how you can use gRPC to communicate between two services. So I have both the apps open, the server and the client, in adjacent windows. I will start them as the first thing, right? So let me start the server and also the client. One thing that you'll notice is in my application properties, I have mentioned different ports for both the client and the server. Um, that is to be able to host both of these applications on the same laptop, and they'll both use different ports, right? So that's how uh, they'll live on the same laptop on different ports, and then they'll try to communicate to each other, right? So if I go to 8081, this is the client, and on 8082 we have the server. Now let's get started with the first step, or rather the second step, which would be to add gRPC dependencies for the server, right? So as you can see in the properties section, I have mentioned latest versions of all of these uh, dependencies that we are going to be adding to your pom.xml, right? The first thing is to add these dependencies to your pom.xml in the gRPC server. So let's just copy it and move over to your form for the server form file. Yeah, I think a couple of dependencies are also already added, so we'll just copy the remaining ones. Done. And as you can see, the versions I've already added, so I'll move on to adding the extensions, the build version, right? So let's get started. All right, just below the dependencies, I think I've made a boo-boo here. Let me just rectify this. This should go here, and this is, well, no, both the dependencies, the build, extensions, everything is added. I'll just refresh my Maven, bring this back up, and yes, this part is done. So I'll just try and restart my app to see that everything is working fine, right? So I'll stop it, restart it again. As you can see, the application is working fine and started. Let's go through the dependencies and on the build config and see what each of them does. So this is essentially a dependency of an open source Spring Boot project, which basically does a lot of the job for you, right? So it takes care of a lot of low level details to make sure that you can use the gRPC communication in your Spring Boot app. These essentially try to solve the same problem. I won't go much in depth. You can always go to this link, check this out, see uh, what these dependencies do, right? And the last two Jakarta annotations are basically, I found out that just adding these three dependencies on their own do not work as expected. You need to provide these additional dependencies, which are internally getting used by the classes from the top three dependencies, right? The build section of it essentially tells Spring Boot to compile your protobuf files, right? You can examine this in detail, but the essential thing that it does is takes up your protobuf files, and we'll get to know what they are in the next section of this video, and it creates Java classes out of them, right? So let's move on to the next step, the next part of it, to understand what protobuf files are, right? These protobuf files are basically, they use gRPC uses protocol buffers for protobuf to define its service contracts, like what will be the APIs, what will be the methods, what will be the objects, or essentially the contracts that you can use to query for information from your server, right? And you need to encode this or embody this, all of these contracts in a proto file, proto file, right? So for example, let's say there's a user service, and this user, we define a file called user service.proto, and this is what it will look like, right? So let's get straight to the services. So let's say there's a get service, there's a save, and there is an update method in the user service, right? So we've defined a service, we have um, defined all of these contracts, and they either accept the user get request, the create request, and update request simultaneously, right? um, Also, what each of them returns is a user response, right? And of course, this is only for example. Your proto methods will follow what you want them to do. So let's say the user create request looks something like an email and a name. The update request looks like you need the ID and you can update the email and the name. And similarly, the get request just needs an ID. You can pass on the ID, get the user response in return, which looks something like ID, email, name, created at, etc., etc. Right. Of course, you can make these methods throw an exception and error message sort of a thing in case something goes wrong, right? So we can maybe define this message as an error message, so which will contain a string message and a code. So the messages are the objects, the services are the APIs, in short, right? So this, like I said, is for a very simple CRUD service that will be part of the server, right? So let's copy this and create a user service.proto in your src main slash proto. So let's get to the server and we'll go there, src main, and in here, apart from the Java and resources folders, we'll make a new one. We'll call it proto. And in here, we'll create a new file. We'll call it user service.proto. Sure. We pasted it. Now what's left is to compile and restart the app. So let's do that. We'll stop the app, compile it again. Compiling it will, like we mentioned in the earlier section, to create actual Java classes from these protobuf files. So once we do that, we would have created the protobuf files. We'll see it in a minute, but let's start the app first. It is starting perfectly fine. Let's go to the target, and you can see there are generated sources, and in this you'll see protobuf and gRPC Java, and you'll see user gRPC, user service gRPC, like the one we have defined. And we'll also see the objects, I think, right? So the objects you created, the get response, and the builders, it has also generated the builders. So basically now in your Java code, you can refer to these classes and play around with them. Moving on to step number 4 is to actually implement the service class. We have defined the contract, now we need to implement it, right? So what we need to do is to create such a class. We need to extend that class with this, right? um let's just try to copy this file and paste it in our Java folder. Let's create a new Java class. We'll name the package as service dot user service, right? So and of course we'll name it accordingly. It's user dot service. Let's make sure that all the imports are in place at gRPC, and I have added all the inputs or the imports here, and as you can see there are still a few errors. So in real life, how you would want to do is, in an ideal situation, is you would be calling some DAO or repository layer to get the user object and then return it back. But in this scenario, for our example, for our purpose, we will just return some dummy response, right? So let's make those changes. Let's first try to create a model user object. Mm, Let's name it model.user, and we'll add the Lombok annotations, getter, setter, builder, no args constructor, and all args constructor. Let's define the properties: private string ID, private string email. Let's see what all properties it has: email and name, and then let's keep the created and updated it as long timestamps. Yeah, so we don't have updated, only created. So our object is ready. Let's just import it here, and let's create a private function. Just entering some dummy values here. This works. This one is for building the proto or the gRPC model, right, which is the user response. And then it accepts a user. So how we do it is response dot build. We have added the utility private methods. Now I'll try to start it. Basically, try and build it once and then start it to make sure everything is working fine. It's building. Let's try and start the app. And I think it's coming up. So great there. Our service definition is ready. Interface as well as the definition are ready now. The logic is ready. We'll move on to the next step. The next step is a simpler one where we just add this line to our application.properties file. This tells Spring where to actually host the gRPC server, right? How is this different from the actual server? The actual server is where the logic runs, but this is the port that the client application will need to connect to whenever it wants to talk to the server, right? So we have added this line. We'll try and rerun the app again. Let's just build it once more. And then we'll try to run it. It's running up, and we can see the gRPC server started listening on address star port 99 up 9090. We'll go on to the next step. The next step is to add these dependencies in the client as well. So the server is ready, up and running. We'll be doing the same thing, same set of steps for the client with some minor changes. Right. So let's move over to the client. Here is the POM, relatively empty right now. We have the starter parent and the starter web, something that defines it as a Spring Boot project. Let me just quickly copy all of these. We'll also add a similar build section as we did for the server, which will tell the Spring Boot app to compile all of those proto files. Right. So this is, I think we're almost ready. Let me just try and explain it once. So as you can see, in the server, we were setting up a gRPC server, but in the client, the artifact ID is a bit different. It says gRPC client Spring Boot starter. Or a lot of other dependencies remain the same, right? And those all are dependencies that we need directly or indirectly to make your Spring Boot act as a gRPC client. We'll try and refresh the Maven project, and try to build it. Hopefully it works. It does. And we do have a main class, so let me try to run it. It's running as well. We can quickly give it a go to verify if the sources are generated. Mm, Nothing here, of course, because we haven't added the proto yet. My bad. All right, the next part is to add the same proto that we have for the server. Right, the dependencies are added. We'll have to implement the client, but how does the client know what all interfaces are exposed by the server? Right, so this proto file is the contract, and it needs to be with both the client and the server to work. Right, so we'll go over to the client and we'll see the location of the proto file. It was at main proto and then the proto file. Right, so that's where we will be keeping it in main, and then we create a new folder. And sorry, this is in jar. My bad. Here is the proto directory. We'll create a new file, user service, done, and then we'll paste the proto file we have. Right, now let's try and build it again and verify that the classes are coming up. It's been built. All right, it is. So here are my proto classes that have already been built. Great. The next step is to try and give it a start to verify that everything is working. Yes, it's working fine with the proto classes. And now let's go over to the implementation part. Right, now we implement the gRPC client. So this is what it looks like. Right, so these clients will officially serve as classes that connect or call the um, interfaces that are already been exposed by the server. Right, so let's try to create a client class in the gRPC client. Let's just call it service for now, as service user service again. Then we'll mark it as a service. Let's try and copy paste this code. You can see now that I have added all the inputs. What I've also done is made a similar model for user that we had for the server class. Here, pretty similar. And we have our methods ready: get, save, and update. for getting, creating, and updating the user. Right. So let me just go over what the code is doing. As you can see, we try to get a blocking stub for at first, which is nothing but saying that we want to create a communication channel with the server. Right. Once that is done, we build a request, and then we simply try to use the channel and do a get call. Right. Um, Similar for our save call, we create a channel, build the request, and call the save interface, the save method, and same way for update. So both our client and server are ready. The communication layers are ready. Let's just try to build and run them again. The build is working fine. Let me try to run. The app has started. Now that both the server and the client are implemented, the next step is to configure where the client is going to uh, contact the server, right? So if you remember in one of the last steps, for the we told that the server can be reachable at port 9090, right? But how does the client know that? So in application properties of the client, we'll define gRPC.client dot the service name, and this is an example greeting service dot address, and then the location of the server, right? So if you can see here, this is already done in gRPC.client dot greeting service dot address is at this location. But in our case, we're not exactly calling greeting service, we are calling the user service, right? So that's how we're going to define this. We will rename this quickly. This was an example. We have renamed it to the proper name user.service. Address is localhost 9090. And the same thing, if we see in the um, server, it's sorry, my bad. This should not be. Yes, for the server, let's try adding it for the server as well again. This should be this grpc.server.port is 9090. It's all ready. Let's try and build and run the app again, and then we'll move on to the next step. Both the client and the server are running perfectly fine. Let's move on to the next step. Now is just how we can try and test this. So we'll add some dummy REST controllers from where we can invoke these um, server methods through the client. So let's go to the client and try to create a class, a custom controller. Let's make it a REST controller. Added all the imports. So I'm ready with the Postman app, and this is where I've hosted my API, the REST controller, and this is how I'm building the response and returning it back, right? We can create similar endpoints for save and create, but let's try to run it, this one for example. One more thing that I did is add this particular line grpc.client.userservice.negotiation type, which is plain text, which basically tells both the apps how to communicate between each other. This is essential for HTTP handshaking. Like, we just add it and move on. Not much details to share there. And let's try and hit the controller, right? So we enter a dummy ID, we get back the response. And let's try to build similar controllers for create an update. Let's call it put mapping, and let's call this post mapping. Let's try to create the user. This is save, and we are able to save it as well. And we should be able to update it as well. All right, the method should be different. Yes. So let's see how what the logs look like. Once we are calling the client, um, not much to see here, but let's see if there are logs received in the server. Not much here as well. All right, cool. Let's add some logs. Let's try and hit it. So this, you can see, the postman called the client, which is running on 8081. The client then calls the server, which is running on 8082, and the gRPC server is exposed on 9090 port, and it calls get and returns back the response to the controller. The controller returns it back to postman is how a gRPC communication is done between two services, a client, which can also be an aggregator service, and a server, which can sort of be the server which holds your data. This is it for the video. Hope you learned something. Let me know in the comments. Thank you.